Radio Casetera.
So when I started my band, the Dresden Dolls, it was 2000, and we were a very DIY band, and we came from folk and punk, and we did everything ourselves because we didn't have a label, we didn't have a manager, we didn't have a booking agent. We just like made flyers, played shows, passed the hat a lot sometimes, and we did everything ourselves for about, I think we didn't sign with a label for about 3 or 4 years. And our ethos with our community was that, we were a family. And then we got really overwhelmed because the band got big and we needed help and we couldn't figure out how we would distribute our music without a label. So we signed with a label, but we signed with a really unfriendly label called Roadrunner. And they did actually a pretty good job with the Dresden Dolls' first record, and they brought us over to Europe, and that was great. And they brought us to Australia, and that was great. But then the relationship got really bad really fast when we put out our second record, and the label decided that we weren't really going to be massive, so we weren't worth bothering with. And I fought very hard to get off the label. And I was still stuck with them for my first solo record, so that was sort of like the death rattle of the relationship. So when I got off that label and I had to fight really hard, I had to like lie, beg, cheat, steal my way off that label in 2009. I was not interested in working with the system anymore. And I had a huge, beautiful fucking family community that I knew would support me. So I started using crowdfunding just off my own website. Then I started using Kickstarter. And now I use Patreon. And even though I still sort of work with the music industry and I still have a publicist here and I have a manager and I have a booking agent and I work with all these normal music industry people, I own all my own music. No one gets to tell me what to do. I get to decide how, when, and with who I do everything. And it has meant a certain bunch of doors, in mainstream media have just stayed closed to me forever. But it also means as an artist, I have gotten to feel completely free in terms of how I do my life. Whether or not I choose to make a decision, whether I want to take time off to spend with my child. So as a woman, especially as a feminist, as a mother, using crowdfunding and making my own rules instead of following the rules of the music industry has been like the ultimate liberation. And my community has basically gone with me. So it's a two-way street. I wouldn't have been able to do it if my community hadn't chosen to pay their money and support me independently and directly. I would have had to find another way. But this way worked because my community took the gamble on me and did these crazy experiments, and they worked.
But you keep stabbing your heart, and you used to have sisters, you don't anymore.
Well, I feel like my relationship with my fans, and I don't even like saying fans, that word kind of bugs me. I spend a lot of time thinking about how music used to be. Like, human history is very, very long. We're this little fingernail sliver at the very end of it. And this whole time, right up until now, with recorded music and amplified music and music being exchanged for money and music as a product, this whole fucking span of human history hasn't been about that. Music has been a way that people connect with each other, and it's not about product, and it's not about sales. And from the dawn of time, you go all over the fucking world, and every culture has used music to live, work, mourn, marry, celebrate, grieve. Like, that's what music has been for fucking ever. And people forget about that because they think that music is the music industry and is Spotify and is albums and is measurable by sales. You know it's not. I know it's not. Everyone instinctively knows that that's not actually what art is, and it's not what it's for. But people forget. And my community is pretty good at remembering, and I remind them, and they remind me, that the music is not about celebrity, and it's not about sales, and it's not about popularity. It's about us reflecting our experiences to one another in a way that just words can't do. And, you know, a big part of my pivot away from the music industry is that I naively thought in my 20s that everyone sort of knew that. And then I found out that there really were a lot of people who didn't believe in the basic, you know, right of music to exist, not as a product, not as a commercial enterprise, but just as this thing that we like need to live. and so, you know, my community is there to make music with me, to have the musical experience with me. They know that I need to eat and pay my rent, so they're like willing to chuck me money. But we all know that it's not about the money. It's about the music. And, you know, the music industry would have you think that you make the music to get the money. You don't. At least I don't.
I wouldn't kill to win a war. I don't get what they do it for.
I think, I mean, everybody who's ever listened to music or had any kind of emotional experience listening to music knows that there is a mystery involved. And, you know, as human mammals, we made music before we made language. It's deep in us as a means of communicating important information to one another. So, you know, I only know that as a teenager, music was like a religion to me. The things that I felt and the way I felt connected to the bands that I loved when I was 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, in those really formative years. You know, I know that when I do my job right, and I feel it a lot on this tour right now, that when I do my job right, I am able to offer someone in the audience something that they can't get elsewhere. They can't get it in a doctor's office. They can't get it at the drugstore. They can't get it, you know, they can't get it anywhere else. There's a kind of a medicinal, palliative quality to music making that fills a space that nothing else can fill. And good music does that. I've had that experience enough times at other people's shows and listening to other people's music and other people's performances to know that if I could explain it and I could put it in a bottle and give it to you, I would make a lot of money. But I'm glad that it's a mystery. I hope we never figure it out. I think the fact that it's a mystery is part of why it works.
Hearts on a string like an old-fashioned phone can. Bang, bringy, ring, and you think
I think that we get in trouble when we separate art, and art is over here and politics are over here. There's just life. It's always all happening at the same time. So art is inherently political, you know. If you are a woman in 2019 living in Donald Trump's America, it doesn't matter if you're singing about, like, I feel free and I'm wandering through a meadow, or I'm going to tell you my rape story. Your song is political. Sorry. Like, by addressing it head on or saying everything is fine, you're still making a political statement. So I think our main problem is just with names and compartments and language. By calling that politics and saying, oh, that's not part of real life, and by calling that art and saying, like, oh, that isn't real life, it's all interconnected and it's all happening right now. So, you know, tell someone in Germany in 1938 that their innocuous cabaret song wasn't political while the Holocaust was going on, and there's just no way to separate anything. You can't.
In my mind, in a future 5 years from now.
Well, it's a good question. I have been thinking a lot about what feminism in music means, especially in the last few years, especially because Trump and Me Too and Harvey Weinstein and all of that. And, you know, my music, my songwriting has been very feminist from day one, from the first songs I wrote when I was 14. And in the context of the Dresden Dolls, you know, we weren't labeled a feminist band. But I think also part of that was because we were a man and a woman. And a lot of the, you know, and a lot of the lyrics weren't as direct as the lyrics that I'm writing right now. But part of the reason that my songwriting has become more direct, especially in the last couple of years, is because it's hard not to want to be direct when Donald Trump becomes president and the climate crisis is oncoming and you're sitting there looking at your child going like, actually, like, I'm not sure I have time to hope that you understand what I'm saying. Like, maybe I just need to say it much more directly. And in that sense, I think that my songs, at least, have become more like overtly, blatantly feminist. But, I mean, if you go back to the Dresden Dolls' first album, you know, looking at the things that I was talking about and listening to Girl Anachronism or Slide or whatever, like, all of that music is about everything that I'm still talking about. It's just got a veil of poetry over it that you have to lean in a little closer to get the message.
In my mind, in a future 5 years from now.
I think political correctness, if that's what you want to call it, is the problem is that there's this pendulum, right? So as soon as a bunch of people start to edge towards freedom, it can get extreme while everyone like founders around trying to figure out how we're supposed to be talking about this, that, or the other thing. And I do think there is a big problem right now, especially in America, especially within feminism, you know, with tone and language. And the overall problem I see is a compassion problem and a nuance problem. Because the like angriest, most punishing people are always rising to the top and grabbing the conversation, which is not leaving a lot of room for nuanced conversation that's got room for mistakes and room for corrections and room for, okay, we don't quite agree, but I see what you're saying. There's just like extreme, no, fuck you. You know, if you don't do it the right way, say it the right way, get it exactly right, then fuck you, you're a racist and you should die. Like, that's not progress, nor is, you know, the very thing that those people are fighting against. But part of that is also a kind of a you know, side effect of the way the internet works and the fact that extremism and those memes and those moments tend to float to the top, which fucks everybody. Because even if 99% of people are actually sort of more in the nuanced, compassionate middle, their voices are not amplified because they're reasonable. So I see it in my own community as a problem. I see it all over the internet as a problem. And I'm a real free speech advocate. I hold some views about free speech that would upset people. You know, I would fight for the right of, you know, an artist, a novelist, a filmmaker, anyone to say things that might feel offensive to some, but I would still fight for their right to be allowed to do that. Because I think when you start getting particular about who is allowed to say what, you can open up a really, really dangerous can of censorship. And we know what can happen when a society gets too censorious, and it's bad. So I would rather that we work on our compassion and allowance, and our our ability to listen to and move with one another than just start making like all of these rules about what people cannot fucking say. I think that that's dangerous.
Polly wants a cracker.
I have had 3 abortions. One when I was 17, 2 after I got married, and the one I had at 17 was by choice. I wanted to finish high school. I was very young. I was not ready to have a kid. And then in my marriage, I had one of them for medical reasons. It wasn't a viable fetus. And one of them because I chose. I just chose. I was not ready. And given what's going on politically in America with abortion becoming more and more inaccessible and the government trying very, very, very hard to illegalize abortion, basically, and also being over here in Ireland, this country, and not just in Northern Ireland this week, I think it's so important that the laws are important. We have to work on that. We have to work on government policy. That's all critical. But also, one of the biggest problems is the stigma and the shame around the story. And so in a sense, it doesn't, even if abortion is safe, free, and legal, if you're still going to shame women and black out their stories and black out their experiences and, force them to continue to live in a culture where no one wants to accept that this is actually happening and that it is an emotional experience and that it is a real experience and that it's an experience that your community should be able to hold. I feel like part of my job as an artist is to stand up and be like, okay, I really don't want to talk about this. I just don't. No one does. No one wants to talk about abortion. It's so personal and it's so complicated and it's so incredibly intimate. But since things aren't working and since millions of people everywhere are dealing with abortion and unable to talk about it and unable to bring it to their communities and unable to address it, I'm happy to be the one without a lot to lose. My family is not going to disown me. My partner isn't going to leave me for talking about these things. So I can. So I will. I will be the one who gets up and says, I will spend a year basically on the road talking about this, even though I don't want to, because we have to. There's so many people suffering out there for so many reasons because this topic is not allowed to be spoken. And the more I talk about it and the more I sing about it and the more I connect with, tons and tons of people out there who have had abortions, also had miscarriages, had children, dealt with all of this shame and stigma that culture dumps on them, the braver I become, because it's just all of this stuff is so normal and it's so common. And, and the problem in culture right now is just the narrative that you're just not supposed to talk about it. We don't want to talk about it. That's just, can you just keep that to yourself? It's like, no, we want a different kind of culture who will accept and take care of us and not shame us and stigmatize us for stuff that is so average.
A heart that's full up like
The problem, one of the biggest problems with being a woman performer, writer, entertainer, and having had a lifelong relationship with the media is that the media tries to set the narrative about who you are, what your importance is, what you're doing, whether it's important, and what we should think about you, what we think about her. And I have struggled with the media my entire career because they have set a narrative that doesn't make sense to me and doesn't make sense to really anyone in my community. And one of the things that I have found so liberating about having a Patreon with 15,000 people just funding our own work, our own media empire, our own journalists on the road with us, our own photojournalists, is that it's almost like taking back the narrative about who I am, what this community is, you know, what we stand for. And you know, and we're growing to the point where, like, I can't afford to bring a journalist on the road with me to write long form pieces about what's happening at these concerts, what's happening at these events, what it means in the larger context, what it means at these communities to be able to, you know, feel and discuss openly about death, abortion, cancer, whatever it is. And it's sort of like fighting fire with fire. You know, I could go out there and spend all of my energy like battling the mainstream media and insisting that Rolling Stone really get my story right. Or I could just ignore them and make my own media and make my own narrative, which is far more powerful. And that is what I have chosen to do, is like leave that system, go over here, go off grid and build my own fucking building. And I think, you know, I think a lot of women especially are learning, as with the tools that we have and with the power that we collectively have, that's the best approach, you know, than trying to take over somebody else's building.
Everyone's too scared to open their eyes up.
I just think that most of the mainstream media is so wants my narrative and wants women in general to be so binary and easily describable that they're completely confused by me. The story is not simple, and since they can't figure out a way to tell the story simply, they just can't tell the story, which is right now lucky. I would rather that they not tell the story than they get it wrong. And, you know, I think there's also something happening in the mainstream media right now, which is like it's completely faltering and underfunded. So there are not a lot of really good music critics, art critics, culture critics who are out there who have the time and energy to work on a big nuanced story like my Patreon or, you know, what is going on this tour. And that's not their fault. A lot of that's just sort of that's just the way the universe is sort of spinning right now. So again, like I'm not going to waste my time and energy like figuring out how to fix them or appease them or correct them. It's just like, we kind of don't need you. A lot of this is becoming very antiquated. We can go over here and we can make our own media landscape on the internet that covers the important stuff, you know, sends the right message, and then uses social media and uses my email listing, uses my Patreon to like get the message out. And we no longer need the authentication of the New York Times. Like, we have this. This is in a way more authentic and bigger because it's made by the people who care about it. I think it depends what you want. I would never judge another artist for signing with a major label. But another artist might not want the kind of life that I want. I don't so much want to just be a celebrated songwriter as I want to be in a community. Being in a community is the most important thing to me. It's way more important than being famous, celebrated, wealthy, not busy. And I would so much rather have my hands dirty and do the work myself and deal with all of the complications that arise from running your own media empire than hand the steering wheel over to a bunch of people who need to keep their company running and need you as a cog in their machine. But that's because I want this kind of lifestyle. If I just didn't want to slave all day over emails and run a media business and, be hanging out with 800 people all the time, I might choose to sign with, a nice small indie label and just be like, you guys do it. Tell me when, I'll tell you when my record's ready. And other than that, I don't want a community. I don't want to work with a bunch of people. I don't want to figure out how to control my own narrative. You can do it. And for some artists, that is actually a more healthy lifestyle choice. Because if they don't want to run a community and that is not their idea of a good fucking time, they shouldn't. And, you know, and all artists are different. I mean, there's so many different ways of approaching this. And it's also like, are you a hip hop artist? Are you a classical artist? Who's your posse? Where are your alliances? You know, and because there are great labels out there. And if your friends run a fantastic indie label and you trust them to represent you and represent your work, and you don't want to do that work yourself, like, God, yes, you do that. You know, just know what you're giving up control of and sign it away. But maybe that's good. That can be good if you're in a trusting relationship with someone. I was so burned by my major label and did not have a best friend who was running a little indie label outside of Boston who I could totally trust, that I was like, I will trust no motherfucker with my stuff. I'm just going to do it myself.
Operated boy sitting on the shelf. He is just a toy.
I mean, Boston is like the crown from which we sprang, right? Like we met, Brian and I met in Boston at my house, and the Dresden Dolls were born in my house in 2000 in Boston. I lived in an arts collective called the Cloud Club. And that's where we played our first gigs, had our first rehearsals, wrote and arranged all of our music. Our first band rehearsals for the first year were in my bedroom in the Cloud Club in Boston. And our first gigs were on the top floor of my house. So we were a Boston band, and we played every single bar, gallery, house, art space, you know, nightclub in Boston. If there was a possible gig, we did it. And our first audience, our first community was in Boston. And then in New York, which was a 4-hour drive. And we would just drive back and forth between Boston and New York, and then we would play the other little cities in New England. And that was the first year, 2 years, 3 years of the band was us just getting in my car and like driving around and doing gigs for free often, anywhere someone would have us. And that's how we built our community. So that's where everything started.
Bang, bring it, ring, and you think you're gonna get something you can bring to a party.
So Neil and I often talk about like the blender setting of art and how you make it. And, you know, the ingredients go into the blender, the ingredients of the world, politics, your life, your family, whatever. And then you can put it on a very high blender setting and like nothing's recognizable anymore. Like that's like sci-fi. Like, whoa, we're all on another planet. Nothing is real. None of the rules are the same. And you just don't, and it's all metaphor. And then, you know, your lowest blender setting would be a song like A Mother's Confession, where it's like, this is what fucking happened to me today. Literally. And I, as I've gotten older, have like dialed it down, and, you know, and he's always had it cranked to 10. But we really appreciate each other's work because, you know, and to hear Neil tell it, I forget how he phrases it, but he basically says what a lot of, you know, fiction writers have been saying from the dawn of time, which is it's all true. It's just true lies. You know, it's all the author's truth with a bunch of costumes on it. And I think a lot of that just has to do with safety. You know, the more gloves and hats and scarves and sunglasses you put on, you know, a fundamental truth, the safer you are. You're not revealing your source, but, you know, sometimes dressing something up can be alluring enough to get someone into the truth. So sometimes you know, if that's your talent, maybe that is your way of luring someone into a larger truth, and that's fine. I love fiction. And, you know, I think Neil and I being a couple is like, it's fascinating because we have those different ways of working, but we really deeply appreciate one another's creative processes. Neither of us would judge or disdain the other's choices or work. It's just, he's over here doing that and I'm over here doing this. You can divide and conquer. Use your talent.
Out in the yard, with my son and my daughter.
Don't be afraid to do it yourself. And actually, the advice isn't even so much for the musicians. It's for the audience, for the community, for the fans. Like, don't be afraid to just directly support the musicians that you love and whose voices you want to raise up. It's actually your responsibility. Don't put the whole onus on the artist. Like, ask how you can help. And be unafraid if they come to you directly for help and resources and money and amplification. Just do it. And that way they will not have to rely on a corrupt system.
Radio Casetera.